Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, Infection to Remediation, Exploring the InfoStealer Kill Chain, sponsored by VMRay. My name is Carol Auth of the SANS Institute. Today's featured speakers are Jake Williams, SANS Analyst and Instructor, who will be moderating today's webcast, and Rohan Viegas, VMRay Analyst and Product Manager. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to Jake.
Hey, thanks so much, Carol. Appreciate it. And want to take the opportunity to thank VMRay for bringing this content to the SANS community. Certainly, I'm excited about the content here. This is something that I think a lot of people have, when I ask somebody, hey, for instance, what is an InfoStealer? They're like, it steals information. And I'm like, yep, cool, that was in the name. Realistically, right, what is it? Why does it matter? And this is one of these pieces of malware. We'll talk a little bit about this, but a lot of people talk about these as commodity malware, and as the name implies here, it's not just, hey, let's look at InfoStealers. It's a lot more. It's talking about the whole kill chain, right, from start to finish. I'll talk about this briefly here, and I think Rohan's going to talk about a lot more of the technical end of it too. Again, a lot of this for us is, what does the overall kill chain look like, and how is this being used, right? There is no such thing anymore as commodity malware. We're seeing nation-state threats, dare I use the word APTs, using what we traditionally referred to as some of this commodity-style malware. And so again, we want to kind of cover this today. We are seeing some substantial financial losses among organizations because of these InfoStealers as well. So again, if this is something you don't have on your radar or it's barely on your radar, this is a great time to level up. And also, again, just based around that, want to again thank VMRay for bringing this to the community. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. As Carol mentioned, I'm Jake Williams, and Rohan Viegas will be with us here to talk about all the great work that VMRay is doing on the InfoStealer side. On my end, I want to talk about overall what is an InfoStealer, how are we seeing these being used in the wild, and then talk a little bit about detection and remediation, right? Because there's a lot that plays into this. Now, listen, honestly, some of the incident responses that we work around this at my company where people get infected with these, we sometimes spend weeks working through all the remediation steps. Some of it's non-technical, getting in, I say non-technical, but I mean not from an IT or IT security side. It's the, going out and figuring out what was compromised as a result, what data could have been stolen, what credentials could have been stolen, and again, how are those being used? Right. So look, as we talk about InfoStealers, as the name implies, obviously they're stealing information, right? They're stealing it from these infected users, forwarding it to a malicious actor. Hopefully that's not confusing. I think we're pretty good on that. But, we see obviously usernames and passwords, typically, again, because attackers like to cash out. We're seeing these a lot of times used for financial and specifically targeting financial institutions because it's a great way to make a quick buck. But again, I don't want you to think about it that it's just financial crime, that there's more than that plays in. Now, some people tell me, they're like, oh, hey, we've used multi-factor authentication, so we don't need to worry. And I'll tell you a little bit later about how attackers are using the multi-factor authentication. I've heard people say, oh, yeah, we use authenticating proxies, so no big deal. Look, bad news for you here is the InfoStealer itself is in the browser. So if your browser can communicate, so can the InfoStealer. Right, so a lot of the endpoint controls that we see being used today, even some of the network controls that we see being used today, are relatively ineffective against InfoStealers once they're on the machine. Again, a lot of times this is going to be a big game of making sure you don't get it on the machine in the first place. Do want to talk quickly about form grabbers. They're a critical component of most InfoStealers, and so the majority of InfoStealers will have a form grabber module that can inject code into the browser and capture specific form fields when they're submitted. Right now, I want to make sure that we understand this is not a web proxy in the network. The connection is not being intercepted. And so you doing network traffic analysis, you are not going to pick up the fact that there's a form grabber stealing credentials or other information out of the form. Right. So again, that's probably one of my biggest clarification points. I've had people before tell me, well, if they're intercepting the data, then that's going to break the TLS connection and the whole, and I have bad news for you. no, that's not the way this works. We even have an example of a PowerShell InfoStealer that we saw actively inserting a certificate, a signed certificate, into the, I say signed certificate, a trusted root certificate to the user, and they actually were proxying the data, which was absolutely epic. Right now, from your perspective on the network, all you're seeing is the legitimate traffic. If you were to do a lot of due diligence and get into very specifically looking at the certificate for the site you just went to, let's say mybank.com, then you would see that certificate was signed by basically their certificate was signed by somebody that you didn't recognize. But again, it's a trusted root, so you're not going to get an alert, right? The key here is that attackers are figuring out how to do this very, very stealthily. And again, network traffic analysis is probably not going to get you there, right? So when we talk about form grabbers overall, again, there's typically no visual warning that a regular vanilla form grabber, one injected to the browser, is stealing information. You're going to see the lock in the browser bar. Everything about the page looks legit. The only thing, again, that you might see, and again, only in a limited set of cases, is that the certificate is technically signed by not who we would expect it to be, right? So we might expect, for instance, your certificate to be signed by, I don't know, VeriSign or whoever, and so a normal trusted root. Whereas when you dive into it, you're like, well, it's a trusted root. It's in my trusted root certificate store, but I don't recognize it, right? So again, kind of making me question, what does trusted mean when we say trusted root certificate? And then people say, though, but look, hey, I don't need to worry about this. Even if an attacker steals my credentials, that they don't have my MFA, right? And so they can't use it to go, to go get on a website. Well, yes and no, right? First off, you got to recognize the user, the attackers in the browser. The fact that the attackers in the browser is bad for you, because anything you can do in the browser, so can the attacker, right? But let's talk a little more about this, because in many cases, they're literally, as you send that request, we've seen a couple here where basically it's sending that request, the stolen credentials, out to legitimate server in real time. They are then generating a SMS back to the user. The user's like, oh yeah, obviously I need to click this link or SMS, whatever. And again, basically they're getting this data before you are. Basically the attacker is acting on this data before you are. They're getting the multi-factor auth because, again, they're presenting you the challenge that you're then solving. Now, of course, you then, as you try to get onto that site, that's basically what's happening there. Then, even though you're trying to follow the multi-factor auth, it's saying, oh no, that token's already been used, and obviously that's not ideal. So look, there's a number of variants of these, and you've probably heard of some of these. Carburp is one that I find a lot of people know under the Carbonac or the Fin7 group. Excuse me. Sorry about that. I got some pollen going on here, I guess. Excuse me. The Carburp malware is one that we've seen used a lot under the Fin7 group name or the Carbonac group name. And so the Carburp is the malware, and it's not exclusive to them. It's been bought and sold on the black market, multiple different times. But these all serve as backdoors, right? So make no mistake about it. When an attacker has an InfoStealer on the machine, they have full control of the machine. They can upload, download files, etc. They've got all that permission. Really the key difference here between an InfoStealer and a traditional backdoor is the dedicated interface for taking that banking and financial account information. So, what if the attacker needs more, right? What if the login form doesn't ask for all the information the attacker wants, right? Like, I see a login into your bank. You go to mybank.com, right? Then we're like, okay, cool, but I really am going to need, your ATM PIN, or maybe your social security number, or your birth date, or your zip code, or whatever. And the login form doesn't ask for that, right? So, one of kind of the rules here is that you can't capture data that's not being asked for, but attackers have an interesting way around that, and they use what they call a web inject. And I want to talk a little bit about these. These web injects allow the attackers to alter document object model, or DOM elements, by injecting additional code, usually HTML or JavaScript, dynamically into the web page. And now the attacker can fundamentally change the login form and ask for anything they want from the user. You need the ATM PIN? No problem. Just add the field to the login form, game on, you're good to go. Right? So a lot of people are going to step back and say, yeah, but that sounds like that'd be really hard to write, and it'd be very, very unique to the specific website. And you're sort of right. In one case, it is very unique to the specific website, right? But I want to caveat here that the people building these form grabbing malware or the InfoStealer malware are usually not the same people using it, right? In many cases, they're selling it on the black market, and Rohan's going to talk a lot about this. Basically, as somebody buys one of these, they then have to configure these web injects. Well, it turns out because this is not phenomenally difficult, but difficult enough, they actually have their own language for development, right? Which is one of the things that I find fascinating about this, this underground economy, because you have Zeus, which is a, very, very prominent info stealing malware family. And Zeus basically standardized the language for writing these web injects. It's so standardized that several other InfoStealer variants use the Zeus web inject syntax to configure their own web injects, right? So again, this is one of these, like, when people come back and they're like, oh, well, we don't have to worry about interoperability. I'm like, dude, the cyber criminals are already doing this, right? Meaning, like, the cyber criminals here are actually dealing with interoperability concerns. Look, we definitely need to be thinking about this stuff as well. So we talk about info stealers in the wild, right? Not enough about kind of how they work. What are they doing? Again, they're injecting direct into the browser. They can alter the document object model. They can see all the data the browser can. How do we see these used in the wild? Two primary methods here, right? One's individual versus bulk targeting, right? Now, I'm not talking about the individual techniques. Rohan's going to dive into this a little bit more with some of the technical techniques. I'm kind of talking about the more, how are they targeting? What are they doing here? Bulk targeting, basically, it's we're just looking for banking credentials, any banking credentials, credit card numbers, etc. Typically, these get stolen by one group and then bundled up with some other stolen data and sold to other criminals, right? So a lot of times the folks stealing the stuff are not the ones doing the cash out operations. Each one has a kind of economy of scale, right? Tricks of the trade and whatnot. And so very often we see this division of labor. I'm concerned about bulk targeting. I'm concerned my mom or my dad or my grandma is going to get hit with this, but I'm not phenomenally concerned with this from an enterprise perspective, right? Individually, yes, absolutely, I'm concerned, but not necessarily from an enterprise perspective. Now I am concerned that an individual that's targeted in bulk gets hit on one of our domain machines. That's a whole different issue, that we may talk about a little bit as we go. But individual targeting, these are the ones that we do a lot of incident response around. Here we've got an executive who's being spearphished. And in most cases, we're targeting a CFO or accounts payable, people that can authorize transactions, right? Attackers, when they compromise one of these users, in most cases, they are going to move quickly to transfer large balances of money, usually through ACH. One of the things that we've seen trending is that we've seen a lot of secondary attacks on the bank immediately after the bank or institution immediately after the ACH. Right, so the idea there apparently, or the idea seems to be that obviously we don't know what the user or what the attacker's intent was, but what we believe the attacker's intent, the reason that they're doing this is that they know that there's a high degree of likelihood that their malicious activity is going to be detected. Right, the fact that they just drained your bank account, transferred $1 million out or $100,000 out or whatever the corporate bank account happens to be, big enough sums to notice, right? And one of the reasons they do big sums is because they don't know how long they're going to be there, right? So take it while it's get it while it's good, kind of thing, and they go, and so we'll see them oftentimes attack the bank and DDoS a bank immediately afterwards, or do some pretty heavy infosec targeting to the bank, not intending to get in, but to be a distraction, right? So basically preventing or diluting the ability of the bank to help the customer recover those funds, even if the customer recognizes and tries to get that transaction reversed. The bank's dealing with their own problems and may have difficulty doing the reversal. This is very, very common with smaller federal credit unions, community banks, etc. And if you think about it, that makes sense because, again, they don't really have the resources necessarily to fend off a large volumetric DDoS attack. They may not have thought about a Cloudflare or other DDoS solution, that kind of stuff. Now, look, I'll mention here, if you find an info stealer in an enterprise, don't treat it as simply as an InfoSec problem. You should be doing out-of-band checks for financial assets. When I say out-of-band, I mean get on the phone. I know in InfoSec, we hate to talk on the phone, right? But that's cool. You probably are working with other people and they can talk on the phone for you. Look, the reason I talk about phone and out-of-band in general, definitely off of domain authenticated machines, is, in the early stages of this, we don't know what the attacker knows yet. And we certainly don't want to tip our hands to the attackers. I will say, don't assume that it's commodity malware, therefore everything's okay. I have dealt with businesses, many businesses, that have been ruined by this faulty logic, taken substantial hits to their to their bottom line, over this. Where they're like, oh, it was just commodity malware, no big deal. And it's like, well, time out, brother, it's a big deal, right? Definitely a big deal. Look, InfoStealer delivery, though, I'll mention here, vast majority of the time, it's phishing. I don't think this is going to surprise anybody. Phishing, and more phishing. Now, historically, if you go read up on some of these, you'll see that, for instance, Zeus, TDL3, a couple of these were heavily delivered by exploit kits. I'll mention that over the last several years, browser exploit mitigations have turned that tide quite a bit. Java used to be the bane of our existence. Flash, right? I mean, it was a running joke about Flash security, and in Java security for that matter too. As we're seeing Java being more and more moved out of the browser, and definitely more sandbox restrictions placed around that, and Flash sandbox restrictions as well. Not to mention the fact that less and less people are using these operationally. We've seen that trend move away from the exploit kits. I will mention that sandbox detonation of attachments can definitely help prevent some delivery, but I want to be very careful here. If you are relying exclusively on a sandbox detection or sandbox detonation, tool today, just be careful about that, right? 1990s, right? We were talking about defense in depth, right? Not one solution, but many solutions. Layered defense, right? And sandbox is no exception to that. Right? We need to be smart about doing good layered defense in depth. Attackers are getting good at counter detection, very, very good at counter detection. If you do have a sandbox product, highly recommend that you tailor that to your environment to make it look like your environment, right? So your detonation machine, that VM, right, is a domain machine, not domain joined, right? But if an attacker looks, it's like, oh yeah, it's joined to a domain. When I say not domain joined, I mean not connected to the domain actively now. But if they look at it, yeah, it's on the domain, right, kind of thing. And has regular process loads, right? There's an outlook running. And that's one of my big things we target in our red team assessments. And I know attackers do this too, because we occasionally see it in some of the more targeted malware. We know if we're targeting an enterprise environment, you're going to have Outlook open. And if you don't have Outlook open, how did I deliver my fish in the first place, right? And so that's one of the things that we're kind of looking at there. And attackers are looking for that too. A lot of our sandboxes are just, baby, vanilla, generic, and they're not going to fall. Attackers are not going to fall victim to that. So, look, detection. I'll mention here a lot of InfoStealers are sold, as malware with the command and control already hard coded, right? Sometimes attackers sell what we call a builder, and I think Rohan's going to talk a little bit about that. But the builders allow you basically to configure brand new executables that you can deliver to the victims. Sometimes you're buying just the malware itself without the builder. And in those cases, in the vast majority of those cases that I've observed, they use dynamic DNS for the command and control. This is a great spot for us to win, not just for InfoStealers in general, but for lots of malware and lots of illicit activity. We should be logging DNS in the first place. And if we are, this gives me a chance to go discover that InfoStealer in the environment, because in most cases, we have some beaconing activity that's going on. When we come to the dynamic DNS, a lot of people are like, hey, don't worry, there's only a few of those domains. But I hate to break it to you, afraid.org is a special dynamic DNS hosting provider with more than 60,000 active domains, with lots more being actively added. And you can see that there. This is a snap from from a couple of weeks ago, but you can see that actively adding domains regularly, right? Now, look, enterprise-consulting.biz, the one down there at the bottom, I don't think most of us are going to look at that and be like, oh yeah, that's totally legit. But I might not click a link to go there. But bear in mind, if my malware is beaconing there, that's that may not be something that's easily detected unless we're doing good DNS logging. So, I'll mention here, there's no legitimate business purpose for dynamic DNS, right? They should be blocked by enterprise security, period. Now, again, providers like afraid.org, where we have new domains being added on a daily basis from their community of users, this makes this much more complicated. But it is a battle that we can win, right? We can at least fight that battle. We can take the 60,000 active domains that are there and start working with those at least, from that start. And it's not just them. Obviously, there are other dynamic DNS providers. I bring them up because they're very, very active in getting new domains out there. Obviously, any attempted access to any of these dynamic DNS domains should be treated like a priority alert, because it's very likely that it's malware, right? We've done some pretty good studies across afraid.org domains and other dynamic DNS domains, and we see far more malware use than anything else. While I'm sure dynamic DNS is used legitimately, it's not used legitimately in an enterprise business use case kind of scenario. So also, InfoStealers do periodic beaconing. Right, we've reverse engineered a lot of these that beacon every 5 minutes, every 30 minutes, every some period. Some of them have some back off timers. There's a little bit of randomization there. But if you have good net flow collection, periodic beacons can be easily detected and acted on. And Rita is a great tool from Black Hills that can help you with beaconing, beaconing discovery. And I kind of throw that out there as something that you can play with a little bit. I don't, again, I wouldn't recommend it as your only line of defense or only line of detection, but it is something that you should be aware of. That again, like all malware, most malware, InfoStealers are beaconing before they're stealing the data, right? They're going to steal the data when you go log in, your credentials, when you go log into your bank account. If you can detect them first, man, that puts you in a huge, or puts you at a huge advantage over your attackers. So finally here, kind of close out with talking about a couple of other techniques. Memory analysis, of course, is another one. My big problem here is doing this at scale. I know how to go find hooking inside of my browser. I also know that unfortunately InfoStealers are packaged with user mode rootkits, and this makes Zeus has one, TDL3 has one. There's a lot of TDL3 actually operates a kernel mode rootkit as well. Look, bottom line, live detection can be a challenge. There's no question about that. But post-mortem analysis, right? If it's a suspicion of, or maybe we're doing periodic audits of some of our high-flying users' machines, and high-flying being like my CFOs, my accounts payables, etc. Maybe I'm doing periodic audits there. Tools like Recall can help us, use this live on a machine without having to capture a memory dump. That's my big challenge, is doing this at scale across an enterprise. But I'll mention that PowerShell frameworks like Conza can help me scale Recall out across an enterprise, and that actually helps detect or can help detect some of this activity. And I'll just throw out a couple of closing thoughts here. Commodity malware can cause significant harm, and I do have to throw out here again, the threat is the attacker. That the malware is just a tool. I always tell people, if you've ever been to Lowe's or Home Depot, there's a whole wall full of hammers in the tool section. I am not a craftsman, one hammer is a hammer. It's a hammer to me, right? I probably can use most of them identically, but in the hands of a truly skilled craftsman, they can do amazing things with some of those more specialized hammers. And again, I want to kind of come back around with this. Just because the malware is commodity, right? Some of these attackers who are highly skilled are doing some pretty nasty and amazing things with these. Again, don't necessarily look at it as, quote, just commodity malware. I'll mention here that even though InfoStealers can search for an exfiltrated intellectual property, right? And that's a thing that we deal with. We find a InfoStealer, or get an alert for an InfoStealer in our security ops center with one of our monitor clients. We hit up the organization to start that incident response, and they're like, "Hey, do you think they're stealing our IP?" Well, it's possible. It's possible they're taking your intellectual property, but that's not my concern. My big concern is that they're stealing and doing immediate financial loss, right? If the IP is gone, it's already gone, right? My big concern, though, is that we get those credentials changed and again, out of band, right? Out of band, changed for any banking or financial applications that may have been compromised. Again, I'll finally close and say that phishing is by far the most common infection vector. I don't think this is a surprise to many, but I think it's important to recognize, that if it's I know we all get tired of hearing about phishing, is the reason I bring this up. So again, it's by far the most common infection method, and yet again, here's another spot where your phishing defenses absolutely matter, right? So look, with that, I want to kind of close out here my piece of this. I'm going to be back, obviously, moderating questions. Please, if you have any questions for me or Rohan, go ahead and drop these into the into the questions box. But we'll get to some questions here at the end. But I want to turn this over to Rohan to talk about some of the technical analysis, the great technical analysis that VMRay has been doing on some of these InfoStealers in the wild, and talk about some of the black market economy around that. All right. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rohan. Rohan, take it away, man.
Thank you, Jake. That was very comprehensive. All right, so good morning, everyone. My name is Rohan Viegas. I am a product manager at VMRay. If you haven't heard of us, we're a malware sandboxing company based in Germany and in Boston. Now, because our product is a malware analysis sandbox, we encounter information stealer samples on pretty much a daily basis. So our research team has been tracking some of the latest info stealers, and that research essentially forms the core of my presentation today. On the call, I also have with me Tamas Boksan, who is our senior malware researcher and analyst. So he'll be helping out, taking technical questions in the background along with Jake and myself, and he'll also be available for technical questions at the end. All right, so let me jump into the next slide. All right, so in this section of the webinar, I'm going to be talking about how attackers get their hands on information stealers, right? So the availability of information stealers. We'll talk a little bit about how such malware is delivered to the victim's systems. And then we'll look at things like the different components of an information stealer. We'll discuss some of the typical behavioral traits associated with this form of malware. We'll also talk a little bit about how stolen information is then sent back to the attacker, the different methods used there. And we'll wrap up by talking about what is it that you need to look for to identify an information stealer. So a lot of this has already been covered by Jake, but hopefully this section of the webinar will also add additional value. Let me start by talking about how easy it is for someone to get their hands on info stealers, right? Now, Jake mentioned this, and it's important to note that attackers do not need to be expert malware authors because info stealers are cheap. They're easy to purchase on underground forums. And, in fact, we'll actually look at cases where there are several legitimate looking websites. So you don't even need to go to underground forums to buy info stealers. Malware authors are openly advertising this form of malware. They design professional looking websites claiming that they're offering a product that you can use to monitor your own PC, for example. Right, so let's look at some of these, both the ones that are available on underground forums, as well as the legitimate looking websites that are more easily accessible. All right, so the screenshot that you see on your screen right now is the form book info stealer, right? You can see that form book is relatively cheap to purchase. Our research team indicates that it actually starts at $60 per month, right? So it's fairly cheap. If I move to the next one here, what you see now is the Agent Tesla info stealer. So again, another popular info stealer available today, starting at $15 a month. Advancing to the next one here, so what you see now is the Remcos information stealer, and then finally the imminent remote access Trojan, or the imminent info stealer. So this is a good example of a very professional looking website offering an info stealer without the need to go to an underground forum. You can actually just Google some of these and you will be actually able to visit their websites directly. So it's very easy, very accessible, and it's easy for attackers to get their hands on info stealers. Now, these info stealers, they're offered in packages. As an example, there could be a package for a set of applications that you want to steal credentials from. There could be a package that could perhaps record keystrokes, or a keylogger package essentially. Or alternatively, you could buy a package that is packed, right, with a packer. Maybe it contains some anti-detection measures, some anti-AV measures. So there's a wide variety of options available in the form of packages. And we will look at this when we talk about the malware builder kit. And then finally, some of the most popular information stealers that our research team has come across are listed here, and you can find detailed reports associated with these info stealers on our website as well. Okay, so let's move on to the actual delivery of information stealers to the victim's systems. Now, as Jake mentioned, the most prevalent delivery mechanism is via spam emails or phishing emails. And typically, as you see on your screen right now, the email contains an attachment, often a Microsoft Word document, which could have a macro inside that does all of the malicious stuff. The second one, and Jake mentioned this as well, is the use of an exploit to attack some application vulnerability. And I want to spend some time talking about one specific exploit, right? So the second screenshot that you see at the bottom here is actually an excerpt from a VMRay analysis report. It shows how a known vulnerability is used by an attacker to plant the information stealer on the victim system and then go on to steal the information from that system. Now, this specific vulnerability, which was associated with Microsoft Office, was actually found in late 2017, and it's associated with a very old Office component called Equation Editor. Now, this component is a feature that it seemed to have been completely forgotten by Office users and developers. It was compiled way back in 2000, and it was left untouched for close to 17 years. And back in 2000, when it was compiled, it was compiled without security protections, which are of course standard today. So, once attackers discovered this forgotten component, they actually set about creating an exploit for it, and it was fairly easy for them to do that. So what you see at the bottom is actually a process graph from an analysis of an information stealer, and you can see that initially a Word document is opened, which is indicated by the winword.exe process, and then it goes on to invoke that equation editor, clearly in this case to exploit the vulnerability that I just talked about. So that's how an information stealer would gain access to the victim system. And this specific example is associated with the Pony information stealer, but the exploit was also used to drop most other information stealers. And an interesting thing to note about the equation editor is that Microsoft tried to patch this equation editor component at first, but in January this year they actually ended up completely removing it because of the problems associated with it. All right, so now that we've seen how an information stealer gains access to the victim system, let's look at some of the components that are associated with the actual malware. Now, the first component is a control panel, right? So this is an interface for the attacker. It basically provides a high-level view of all of the systems that attacker has infiltrated, information about associated stolen information, and so on. It also sort of allows the attacker to control the client-side component. So if you look at the screenshot, and my apologies, it's not very clear here, but you can see that there's one infiltrated machine on this attacker's control panel. You can see the details of that machine are also available in the table below. On the top of the dashboard, you can also see the number of keystrokes that have been logged already. 185 passwords have been stolen, and then 3 screenshots have been recorded as well. So as you can see, this is clearly designed for the non-technical attacker, and that's what makes this business model, very lucrative one for malware authors. They have a much wider audience of potential buyers. The second component that I want to talk about is the actual malware builder kit. Now, this is the actual component that sits on the victim's machine, and it does all of the information stealing. So in order to understand the capabilities of this component, let's look at what you can build or bake into this malware builder kit. Now, malware authors kept non-technical attackers or buyers in mind, and they designed a very simple builder, sort of a wizard, as you will see, that basically lets attackers decide what capabilities they want to build into their client-side component. And I'm going to walk through all of the steps involved in this process, right? So step 1 is basically defining the settings for remote access, right? So things like entering the URL of the control panel we just saw in our previous slide, and also defining how you want your stolen information to be sent back to the remote servers, right? So in this case, you can see there are options for SMTP or the option to enter FTP credentials for sending that stolen information back to the attacker. Step 2 is essentially deciding what logging capabilities you want to build in, or what logging capabilities the attacker wants to build in. right? So do they want to record keystrokes? Do they want to capture screenshots, perhaps take webcam captures, and also how often they want to do this. So this is that first stage in the whole customization process in terms of information stealing. Step 3 is actually choosing browsers, mail clients, and other applications that the attacker wants to steal data from. So you can see, the list of options here covers pretty much all of the commonly used browsers, mail clients, FTP clients, and so on. Right. So again, now there's more customization that can be built in. Step 4 takes this a step further, right? So now if you want to do things like, for example, block AVs, or maybe add persistence to this malware, or perhaps even disable some applications, you could do that here. Disabling some applications that could potentially affect the malware's ability to steal information, or probably lead to the detection of the malware, obviously helps the attacker as well. So there's that next level of customization that's available to the attacker. Step 5, and this is very interesting, is essentially allowing the attacker to choose a fake message that they want to display to the user, right? So an error pop-up or an information message pop-up, and an associated message to go with that. So that's another step that's built into this builder kit. The last step is basically configuring the secondary payload, right? And so as Jake mentioned as well, information stealers are usually, what they do is that they download the payload from a remote server. And so you would specify the location of that secondary payload here. And once you've done all of that, all you have to do is click a button, and the whole malware is built for you. So, clearly an easy process, a lot of customization that's available, and this makes it usable to even a non-technical or an unskilled attacker. Okay. All right, so that covers the different components associated with information stealers. The next step is basically understanding what behavior traits they exhibit, right? So what would you normally see when an information stealer runs on a victim system? Now, depending upon what capabilities the malware attacker built into the information stealer, using that builder kit that we just saw, you would see different behavior on a victim system, right? Or in our case, if you're looking to analyze such malware using a malware sandbox, you would see different behavior based on what's actually built into the sample. So based on our research, we've seen a number of behavioral traits. We've tried to highlight some of the interesting ones here. So you can see, for example, on the screenshot in the top right corner, right up there, there's an attempt to detect AVs and firewalls, right? So this is an excerpt from the analysis report for the Adwind InfoStealer, which clearly shows this detection of AV and detection of firewall behavior. If you move down to see to the next screenshot, that's from an analysis of the Azure ult information stealer, and you can see that in addition to things like saved browser credentials and browser cookies, it's also looking to steal things like crypto coin wallets. Right, so this is something that that was unique to Azure ult. And then moving on, information stealers typically look to log keystrokes. They can also capture screenshots, capture webcam, and several other behavioral traits that we didn't find interesting enough to list on this slide, but there's several more. So yeah, if you're interested, we have several reports of information stealer analyses that are available on our website. So you can go there, take a look at all of the behavioral traits associated with information stealers. All of that information is available on our website. Okay, So the last part of the information stealer kill chain is actually sending all of that stolen information back to the attacker, right? Now there's several ways to do this, and as part of our research, we've actually seen different information stealer families use different methods. The first screenshot that you see on the top right actually shows the Azure ult family's custom communication protocol. Right, so that's fairly easily identifiable, very recognizable, and can be associated directly with Azure ult. There are also less sophisticated methods, right? So things like uploading the data to an FTP server, an approach that's taken by the Hawkeye information stealer, or simply emailing all of the stolen information. And if you look at the screenshot at the bottom there, that's what the agent Tesla sample is doing in that case, right? It's looking to take all of that stolen information and simply send it in one big email to the attacker. With agent Tesla, an attacker can configure the underlying method using the malware builder kit that we talked about. So it's not always the case that all of that stolen information is sent via email. Okay, and then the last topic that I want to cover here, and Jake touched on this as well, is what can I look for, or what are the telltale signs associated with information stealer, right? How do I know that what I'm looking at is an information stealer, besides the obvious signs that it is trying to steal information? Now, if you're using a malware sandbox like VMRay, all of the analysis is done automatically for you, and you can see in the screenshot in the top right, the sandbox will show you pretty much everything that the info stealer tried to do, right? So from brute forcing the user account, trying to read application data, trying to steal cryptocurrency wallets, to things like actually connecting to a remote host, downloading the payload, process injection, and again sending all of that information back to the attacker. So you can trace the whole kill chain if you actually try to analyze an info stealer using a sandbox. But some of the more telltale signs, if you're sort of looking at this in bits and pieces or doing a manual analysis, is recognizable network traffic, right? So as is the case with the customized communication protocol used by Azure ult, for example. So often, these network signatures are very recognizable. Another thing to look for is basically if you have things like an executable file that's connecting to a PHP script. Now that's clearly something that's suspicious and may be associated with an information stealer. Unusual access is another telltale sign of an information stealer. If you have something like the cookies of a web browser being opened by something other than the web browser, that's clearly suspicious, and more often than not, it is a sign of an information stealer. And lastly, the whole browser injection discussion that we had with Jake as well, that's an indicator of an information stealer on most occasions as well. Specifically the form grabbers that Jake talked about, or banking trojans which are looking to grab passwords, or looking for information that you would enter on a specific website. Those are good examples of info stealers that use the injection into browsers. So in the screenshot on the bottom right, that's another analysis from VMRay Analyzer, and you can see one of the more popular information stealers today, Formbook. You can see there's a little blue box that's highlighted there, and it shows you that one of the processes is actually injecting code into the Firefox process, presumably for form grabbing or stealing banking related information. Okay, so that's all I have for this webinar. Just a quick recap. So information stealers, as the name would suggest, they gather login details, website credentials, passwords, financial information, anything that's personally identifiable information that can be sold on the black market. Essentially, they're fairly easy to acquire. They're relatively cheap. They're usually delivered via phishing emails or spam emails with attachments. And there are builder kits that are designed for non-technical attackers. They provide a wide range of options, including, a very easy to use control panel. And once all of the information is stolen, there are multiple ways of sending the stolen information back to the attacker. So yeah, with that, I'll hand it back to Carol to see if you have any questions, and I hope this was helpful to all of you. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Rohan. That's outstanding. This is Jake. I'm gonna actually handle the questions today, but that was outstanding. I've actually got a couple of questions for you. And by the way, if you're one of the attendees and you have any questions, please drop them into the chat here. We've got a few minutes to answer some of these, and we'll be more than happy to answer questions live. Also known as free consulting, I think, is what it comes down to. That said, hey, Rohan, I'd like to tag you with this first question down here, and it asks actually about antivirus detection. One of the folks asks, are most of these prepackaged malware variants here, these InfoStealers, are they detected by AV? And if not, how do they avoid detection, right, when they go out and are, basically, let's say, a mass phishing campaign? How are they avoiding that detection?
Yeah, so typically signatures take some time to get developed. So it probably takes a little bit of time before, let's say, a new InfoStealer variant out there starts to be detected by AVs. So there's always a bit of lag, especially with new and zero-day variants. But in terms of actually evading antiviruses, I'm going to defer to Tamash. So Tamash, do you have any specific examples or ideas of how they would try to evade AVs?
Sure, it's part of the packer or crypter. So to evade the static analysis, they would use these packers, which try to modify it in a way that's not detected by the heuristics of the antivirus software. As for the behavioral ones or sandbox detections, they would use some anti-sandboxing technique.
Great. Thanks, Tamash.
Sure, and I'll actually contribute a little bit back in here, and I'll mention that there's a whole underground economy of basically a site that used to be very, very active. I believe they got busted, if I'm not mistaken, but there's several others. Scan4U.net was basically was a almost like, you can think about it like a virus total for attackers, right? Where attackers would basically upload a sample to this to the site that had umpteen different antiviruses running, and it would actually basically scan that sample across all these different AVs. And so the attacker then, the advantage to the attacker with using a service, an illicit service like that, is that none of that data is ever shared. The scans performed technically offline. None of the data ever gets shared with the antivirus companies, unlike, Virus Total, right, where everybody and their brother gets a copy of those samples. So the attackers here, really, and as the other gentleman mentioned there, talking about the packers and cryptors, right, it does allow them to go change that signature quite a bit, right? So another one that I'd like to kind of tag here, there was a question about price differentials. You showed several different variants, Rohan, and there was pretty wide variation in prices, right? Why is there such a big price difference, and what are you getting for like some of the higher, like if I'm an attacker, why would I ever pay more than like the bottom line InfoStealer? Don't they all do the same thing? Or can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, sure. So I think it all boils down to the features and capabilities associated with the InfoStealer family, right? So you may have the cheap ones or the simple ones, which only allow you to steal credentials, let's say from disk, right? Some of them, and we saw, for example, Azure Ult, which lets you basically steal crypto coin wallets. So as you start to add features and the ability to steal different types of information, you would see a variation across the price as well, right? So the more expensive information stealer families tend to be the form grabbers, which typically inject into browsers, and so they can steal information that you're entering into a bank website or any confidential website. And then the most expensive families are banking Trojans like TrickBot. So these tend to be more complex. They have a very, very large variety of features and are capable of doing much, much more in terms of information stealing than your typical run-of-the-mill cheap info stealer.
Sure, sure. Hey, that's a great explanation there. In your experience, you kind of mentioned some of the top end ones are the banking Trojans. Do you mind? I know I'm putting you on the spot a little bit here, but do you have like an idea of kind of like a price range, right? Kind of like a low and a high, as far as kind of like a per unit, or can you kind of speak to that at all? Or if not, by all means, say so.
Yeah, so unfortunately, I don't have an idea, but maybe I can check with Tamash. Tamash has done a lot of research with information stealers, so maybe he has an idea about the price range associated with the top end or the banking Trojans, essentially.
I don't have a price range for banking Trojans either. I don't know.
I mean, I can give you some sample prices that we've seen in the past, for some of the banking Trojan platforms, like a one-time purchase. And if you get it caught, then you've got to come back and get it recompiled. It would generally be in the $1,500 range. But, I don't, that's sampling, not price ranging, right? So, obviously my sample set's pretty small since I'm not, buying these on a regular basis. But, but I mean, it does kind of speak to, right? You start looking at some of these, $1 million ACH losses, right? And multi-$100,000 ACH losses. When you realize that an attacker can spend, for a top end Trojan, $1,500 and go for it, right? And some of the stuff you had up there was in the, in the double digits, like my kid could afford, my 12-year-old could afford to, to pay that kind of thing. It really speaks to, how commoditized, this underground economy has become.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I think really speaks to the, honestly, for me at least, speaks to the need for kind of for that, having sandboxing and having that good defense in depth, because again, particularly in the enterprise setting, those losses can be absolutely huge, and the attacker obviously, their cost to deploy one of these attacks is very, very minimal compared to our cost to defend against one. It's very, very asymmetric. Right? Do you want to speak to that at all?
Yeah, the other thing associated with information stealers, Jake, is that very often leaked or maybe cracked versions of these malware builder kits become available, and what that means essentially is that that whole information stealer family becomes available for for virtually free, and as a result, the lifetime of that information stealer increases. It becomes even more commoditized. So there's several things that contribute to the fact that the info stealer market itself is so commoditized. It's so easily accessible to attackers, and that's one of those things.
Sure. Well, hey, I've got another question in here about the diversity actually of the info stealer scene. Kind of the why do we see so many of these? Why? If these are so effective, right? I mean, you talked about TrickBot. You mentioned, obviously Carburp is a big one. At the top end of the banking Trojan side. All the way down to some of the ones that you were mentioning in the more commoditized scene. Why are there so many different families, right? Why is there not like one to rule them all? You want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so there's a few things to consider there. Obviously, the underlying thing is, different families have different feature sets, and so that contributes to the fact that they can coexist because they have different prices and obviously different feature sets. The other thing is the whole information stealer market itself is much slower to progress than, let's say, ransomware. The ransomware family, right? Typically with ransomware, once the decryptor becomes available, the ransomware needs to evolve, or that's the end of that because it's no longer useful. But it's very different with information stealers, right? Families can stay around for multiple years. We've seen Pony variants, for example, that have been around since 2011. Agent Tesla that we talked about has been around since 2014. So it's a very different market. Families coexist because they have different features, different price ranges, and again, I mentioned earlier as well about how sometimes these malware builder kits, they get leaked or cracked versions become available, and so that whole family becomes essentially available for free. So all of these things sort of contribute to sort of extending the lifetime of an InfoStealer family, and the fact that you have so many different feature sets associated with every family means that you have multiple families that may coexist at the same time.
Sure, sure. Yeah, that's very, very well put. So I got another question in here from the audience asking about next generation firewalls with deep packet inspection, right? And I'm gonna kind of squash that down a little bit or genericize that down to network detection and defense. What do you think about network detection versus endpoint versus sandbox? Do you want to speak a little bit to that as far as detection and defense?
Yeah, so I can definitely speak to the sandbox side of it, Jake, but do you want to sort of touch the other aspects?
Yeah, sure, definitely.
Yeah. Oh yeah, so from a sandbox perspective, right? So obviously a sandbox is looking at looking to detonate a file and looking to look at all of the behavioral aspects associated with a file. And so unless you've got a situation where the file does not reveal its behavior because it's got built-in anti-sandboxing that your sandbox cannot deal with, you will see the behavior of that file being revealed inside the sandbox. I would say it's a very effective method to detect, perhaps even the most effective method to detect advanced malware. So you get all of the behavioral traits associated with the file that you're analyzing. You get all of the IOCs, so information like the host that was looking to be contacted, and things that it was looking to steal on your system, for example. So all of that information, all of those IOCs are available to you with a sandbox analysis. So in a nutshell, perhaps the most effective way to deal with advanced malware, including InfoStealers, and giving you information like IOCs and pretty much anything you'd need to work with.
Yeah, I'm actually going to kind of echo that here and just say that networking and endpoint solutions are great, right? And everything has a place, and obviously any Rohan even spoke to this a little bit. Even sandboxes can be beat. There are sandbox detection methods specifically, and obviously sandbox vendors are constantly evolving their products to deal with those. But when it comes down to it, I think the biggest thing for me as an InfoSec professional, is signal to noise, right? When we take a look at a well-instrumented endpoint and a well-instrumented network, I think most attacks, the majority of attacks, can be detected either at the endpoint or on the network or both. But you have a very, very high noise to very, very low signal ratio. Whereas with a sandbox, when I get a confirmed hit, I've got a very, very high, very, very high signal, right? And so, when I'm looking at my endpoint, my network, I've got a lot of noise there, and I'm basically trying to find that needle in the haystack, right? So I think that's one of the big benefits that Sandbox gives me as part of a layered defense model, is that it's a great spot to go and deep dive on, basically deep dive that analysis and not have a lot of noise to deal with. So I think that's a good spot for us to go ahead and hand it back over to Carol. I realize we're hitting the bottom of the hour here, getting our hour, completing our hour here together. Rohan, I want to thank you for contributing here, as well as the rest of the VMRay staff, and thank you for bringing this content to the SANS community.
Well, thank you, Jake. And if you guys have any additional questions, feel free to write to us. You can see our email address here on this slide, info@vmray.com. We'd be happy to answer any of your questions.
All right, and thank both of you, Jake and Rohan, for your great presentation, and to VMRay for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.